Good evening once again. This is Pete Jones with History Hunters, brought to you in part by Grandstaff Henkin Funeral Home. And today we're going to talk about a man who was born in Wabash County, a man who was really a household name in his time, one of the most popular journalists of his time. But today, sadly, all but forgotten. His name was Edgar Watson Howe, and he was born either in 1853 or 1854. He isn't sure. He wasn't certain. In Treaty, just a few miles south of Wabash. Now, like Johnny Olson, we talked about a month or so ago, and about George Mullen, the baseball player. Again, these people were once very famous, and they all had Wabash County connections. And now, again, they are all but forgotten. Ed Howe, born in Treaty to parents who were itinerant Methodist preachers and farmers. And 3 or 4 years after Ed Howe's birth, they did leave Wabash County and moved to Bethany, Missouri, where his father started a print shop. Now, all little towns in those years had print shops. And if you had a print shop, you were likely also to start a newspaper. And Ed Howe's father not only preached in Bethany, but he started a little newspaper that failed very quickly. But that must have put journalism in Ed Howe's blood, because as he moved through life, he was always involved in newspapers or magazines. The father left the family shortly after the establishment of the newspaper in Bethany. And at about the age of 15, Ed Howe himself hit the road and became what was known as a tramp printer. Tramp printers traveled all over the country seeking work in print shops wherever they could find it. And as a tramp printer, Ed Howe worked briefly in such places as Omaha, Nebraska, Salt Lake City, and other places. Cheyenne, Wyoming would be another place where Ed Howe was involved briefly. And no doubt he found brief work in other little towns, smaller towns than those that I mentioned. A tramp printer would travel with his clothes literally on his back. He'd seek out work wherever he could find it, and maybe stay only 2 or 3 weeks, if that, in one town. But again, Ed Howe's blood had tasted journalism. And by 1873, Ed Howe was in Golden, Colorado, a tiny town at that time. And he started a print shop and, of course, a newspaper. He named his newspaper The Globe. And 2 other newspapers that Ed Howe would start were also named The Globe. Now, the one in Colorado failed very quickly. And so, like a tramp printer, he moved on to Falls City, Nebraska. Again, the story was the same. He started a print shop, he started a newspaper, named, of course, The Globe, and like the one in Colorado, it failed quickly. And from Falls City, Nebraska, though, in 1877, he landed in Atchison, Kansas, in the northeast corner of Kansas. Now here he found success, because when he arrived in Atchison, the town had a population of about 7,000, and within 10 years, that population doubled. So there were lots of opportunities for him in his print shop and advertising in his newspaper. And it was in Atchison that Ed Howe found, finally, success. He had the writing bug. also in his blood. And not only was he an excellent reporter, but he turned his hand to writing fiction eventually. But in Atchison, he got to know practically everybody in town. And it's interesting that while Ed Howe was, just before Ed Howe came to Atchison, Amelia Earhart of aviation fame was born in Atchison. Now there's no record of it, at least not that I have found, but surely somewhere along the line, Ed Howe would have known Amelia Earhart's family. I find that intriguing. I'd like to find some correspondence or something between the families. When Ed Howe lived in Atchison, he was fascinated by small town life. He was an excellent reporter. He was always out on the street digging up news, talking to people, stopping in their shops, stopping in their stores, attending local government meetings. And that's the way a small town newspaper is built. And Ed Howe was excellent at this. But he wasn't satisfied. He had a desire to write fiction. He said one time he had always wanted to write a novel. And so while he was producing the newspaper there in Atchison, which was by that time a daily newspaper, he'd go to the office at 7 in the morning. He wouldn't leave the shop until the paper was put to bed or when it went to press at about 4 in the afternoon. He'd work a couple more hours and then finally go home for a late supper. And then at the kitchen table, he would sit and write in longhand what became the manuscript of a novel called The Story of a Country Town. It's a pretty dark book in many aspects. And when he finished writing it, he sent it off to one publisher after another. The first two rejected it without even a note of thanks. Another 3 or 4 publishers responded, but told him they were not interested in his book. So what would a printer do? Well, of course, he had a press, he had the type, he had the ink, and he had the paper. So he printed the book himself, put it together with very flimsy paper covers, and sent it off on his own to Mark Twain and to probably the man who was the most respected literary critic of his time, William Dean Howells in Cincinnati. Now that took courage to, here's an unknown guy, here's an unknown author whose book has been rejected time and again, and yet he has hopes for it. So he sends it to these 2 very famous people. And lo and behold, they both liked it. And that encouraged Mark Twain to contact publishers that he knew. And pretty soon, the book, the manuscript, was in the hands of reputable publishers. Now, The Story of a Country Town, still in print after all these years, but it is recognized as a landmark work in realism, realistic fiction. And you can still go to Amazon and buy a copy of The Story of a Country Town by Ed Howe from Treaty. In that book, or in the preface of that book, he writes that in every chapter there is the sound of the midnight bell, because he would sit at that kitchen table for hours, writing until the small hours of the morning, and then get up and go to work again. A remarkable, consistent fellow we have here. Money came in from that book, it sold well, and Ed Howe had the bug to travel. His first foreign trip was to London. We don't know what he did there because he didn't keep a journal of that trip, or at least not one that has come to light. but it gave him the desire to travel time and again. And in the course of his life, he would make 2 trips around the world. Remarkable, really, for a man in the Middle West in those years. His wife divorced him in 1901. She claimed desertion. Well, you can speculate maybe had traveled without his wife, we don't know. And the long hours that he spent in the shop surely took a toll on his marriage. The money that he earned, though, from the book, allowed him to buy a farm at the edge of Atchison, Kansas, a place known as Potato Hill, and he built a new house on that property, and he named the house Potato Hill. Keep that in mind, because that becomes his moniker in later years. He ran the newspaper until about 1911. He grew tired of it by that time. He was physically and mentally worn out. And all he wanted to do was retire to Potato Hill and do some writing of a different nature. He became known as a homespun philosopher. Now, he rejected that title, and he became known as a philosopher. He became known as the sage of Potato Hill. And he vigorously denied that he was any sort of sage. He became rather famous for his biting humor, some of which is, it borders on being politically incorrect today, but I want to read a couple of things that he wrote. He said if there were no schools to take children away from home part of the time, the insane asylums would be filled with mothers. Think about that for a moment. But then he could also write in a mellow fashion about children. Children are the living messages we send to a time we will not see. He filled his time writing things of that nature. So many things that he decided he would produce a magazine, which he called E.W. Howe's Monthly. And that sold remarkably well across the country and even in countries in Europe. And it was Ed Howe's Monthly that made him a truly famous person, a household name, as they said, in those years. He would print some of the letters that he got from his readers, some that commented on his magazine. One of my favorites is this. He said, I got a letter from a man in western Kansas. He said, I wish you would send my sister your magazine. She is losing her mind. Well, draw your conclusions from that. Ed Howe was always willing to comment, sometimes sarcastically, on the events of the day. Earlier, he had written this about Marconi, the inventor of radio. There is a little something in the wireless telegraph, but not much. It will never be of practical use. Marconi is a joke. Mark the prediction from a little old country editor. Well, Ed Howe, of course, was dead wrong on that, because Marconi's invention of radio is one of the landmark inventions of all time. He also cast doubt on the wisdom of the Wright brothers, the first to fly. He wrote this in his newspaper. On a farm in Leavenworth County, Kansas, lives a brother of the Wright brothers who are trying to learn to fly. The Kansas member of the Wright family is a farmer and wiser than his noted brothers. Someday, the Wright brothers who are trying to fly will have a tumble and be smashed to a pulp. Then the Kansas member of the family will realize that he is the real genius of the family. The Wright brothers are a nuisance that will go away in time. Whatever you do, Don't sink your life savings into flying machines. Pay to see them at a county fair, but go no further. Well, Ed Howe was right on lots of things, most of the things he wrote about, but he sure missed the boat on Marconi and on the Wright brothers. He published his magazine until 1933, and like the newspaper business, he finally grew tired of the magazine. In between 1911 and the start of his magazine and the time that he closed it, he wrote his autobiography called Plain People, because he named it that because all his life he had dealt with plain people in the plain towns on the Great Plains. And the autobiography, Plain People, is, again, a rather dark and sad look at certain aspects of life. It's always been interesting to me that a man who wrote so darkly about so many things also was famous for his humor. Toward the very end of his career, some friends in New York City gave a testimonial banquet for him in the Waldorf Astoria. And I was really stunned when I saw in an old copy of the New York Times, an account of that dinner and the mention of some of the guests who were there. Bernard Baruch was there, a wealthy banker and a counselor to many U.S. presidents. Irving S. Cobb, one of the most successful humorists of the time, was at that banquet. Ring Lardner, who started his career in journalism as a sports writer and became so well known for his short stories. Grantland Rice, maybe the best known sports writer of his period, was there. And so was Gene Fowler, again, another sports writer who branched off into writing novels and plays and nonfiction. Walter Winchell, a man we've almost forgotten about today, but he was once the most read newspaper columnist. Winchell was at that testimonial banquet. John T. McCutcheon, a man from Indiana, by the way, who also had made his mark in the newspaper business. And then two men who were mentioned in that guest list with no connection to journalism. Fritz Kreisler, the noted violinist. Now, don't confuse him with the Michigan football coach of later years, but Fritz Kreisler was there, and so was John Philip Sousa, the March King. Now, where along the line did this man from Treaty, Indiana, come in contact with such notable people? We may never learn how he made those connections because he was largely silent about that. When he finally quit his journalistic endeavors, he was very sincere and he was deadly honest about why he was leaving. He said, "I'm quitting because I am tired. People bother me. I don't know why Tom Davis didn't get his paper last night, and I don't want to be bothered with his complaint. Because I know everybody in Atchison and everybody knows me, I am subjected to a ceaseless round of petty and trivial annoyances." Again, how could a man with such a sense of humor write things like that? He also wrote in his autobiography, he said, "If my wife tells me we're having dinner guests, that ruins my entire day, and I accomplish nothing else but worry about the dinner." Well, Ed Howe was certainly a man of contradictions. He died in 1937, died in October of 1937. He got a very long and very laudatory obituary in the New York Times. You know, some people consider that the mark of success, if when you die you get an obituary in the New York Times. Well, he got a what would have been to him a very pleasing editorial in the New York Times. In the end, he had written more than a dozen books. He had created a magazine that was highly successful, and he had made his name a household name. Back in Atchison, the current owners of the Globe had this to say in an editorial on his death. Let me read this, please. Mr. Howe's fame rested largely on his ability to be concise. As a newspaperman, magazine writer, and novelist, he constantly strove for expression and that manner of expression did much to establish him in the world of letters. He was uncanny in his ability to condense an opinion to a few lines and get his idea over to the public. But here's the hallmark, I think, of Ed Howe. As a country reporter, Mr. Howe was without peer. While gathering news, he worked on the principle that every man or woman has an interesting story or knows something interesting. And for that reason, he was a source of news or community lore. The editorial continues. We marveled at the way Mr. Howe used to go along Commercial Street in Atchison and contact people. He managed to get news from every type of person, from laborer and bankers alike. We remember the days of blizzards. The temperature would be 15 degrees below zero, and the wind would be howling around the corners, beating the snow and sleet against the storefronts. And a glance up and down Commercial Street would meet with no human being. And yet, Mr. Howe would be there making his regular rounds, finding small groups of men huddled around stores and stoves, and would, upon his return to his desk, pound out 3 columns of interesting news and comment. That, again, to me, is the epitome of a small-town journalist. Forgotten though he may be, if we can claim Thomas R. Marshall from North Manchester, who was Vice President of the United States, but Marshall's family moved to Columbia City within a year after he was born, yet we still claim him in Wabash County. And I think we can certainly claim a connection with Ed Howe, a remarkable reporter born in Treaty. Thank you for watching. I'm always happy to answer questions. I think they'll put my email address on the screen, but it is peteinwabash@gmail.com. And please, if you're curious about anything we've talked about, if you have any questions, I will respond to you. Thank you for watching.